He was raised in the Marcy houses, one of the most notorious public housing projects in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood where the options available to a young man without money, without connections, and without institutional support were narrow enough that most people who grew up there never escaped the circumstances they were born into. His father abandoned the family when he was 11 years old, leaving a wound that would take decades to fully reckon with. He never finished high school. He had no fashion training, no design background, and no experience in the clothing industry. What he had was an understanding of culture so precise and so far ahead of the market that when he finally decided to turn it into a business, the business grew faster than almost anyone in the American fashion industry had seen before. In 1999, and Jay-Z and his business partner Damon Dash launched Rocawear with $6 million in startup capital. Within 3 years, it was generating $250 million in annual revenue. Within 8 years, it sold for $204 million. This is the story of how a boy from the Marcy houses in Brooklyn built one of the most successful fashion brands in American history, and what happened when the empire he built outgrew the partnership that created it. If you are new to this channel, welcome. If this kind of story is what brings you back, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now let us get into it. Sean Corey Carter was born on December 4th, 1969 in Brooklyn, New York, and grew up in the Marcy houses. There's a public housing project in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood that was home to thousands of families living in the compressed circumstances that defined low-income urban life in New York City during the 1970s and 1980s. The Marcy houses were not simply poor in the economic sense, they were poor in the way that concentrated urban poverty creates a specific and totalizing environment, one where the physical boundaries of the project, the towers and the courtyards, and the streets immediately surrounding them, define the practical geography of a child's daily existence, and where the social and economic forces operating within that geography shape expectations about what is possible in ways that are difficult to overstate from the outside. His mother, Gloria Carter, raised Sean and his 3 siblings largely on her own after his father, Jadnis Reeves, left the family when Sean was 11 years old. That abandonment was a rupture that Sean would carry with him for decades, a formative wound that expressed itself in his work and in his public statements about his life, with a candor that most public figures of his stature would have been reluctant to display. Gloria Carter worked hard to keep the family stable, and the stability she provided under genuinely difficult circumstances was itself a significant achievement, but it could not insulate her children from the environment they were growing up in, or the choices that environment placed directly in front of them every day. Sean was intellectually precocious in a way that his school environment had difficulty recognizing or rewarding. He was a voracious reader with a memory for language and a facility for wordplay that expressed itself most fully not in academic contexts, but in the freestyle rap competitions that were a defining feature of the social life of young men in his community during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Hip-hop culture was emerging in New York during exactly the years of his adolescence, developing in the parks and community centers and street corners of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Harlem into a form of artistic expression that had no institutional framework, no commercial infrastructure, and no critical establishment, and that was therefore entirely owned and operated by the young people who created it. Sean absorbed that culture from its earliest stages in developing a relationship to language and rhythm and the expressive possibilities of rap that would eventually make him one of the most commercially successful recording artists in history. If you are enjoying this story so far, now is a great time to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video. There are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss them. The path from the Marcy houses to the founding of Rocawear ran through a decade of struggle in the music industry that tested Jay-Z's belief in his own abilities, with a consistency and a thoroughness that would have ended the ambitions of almost anyone with less certainty about what he was building toward. He had been developing his skills as a rapper through his teenage years. I'm building a reputation in New York's underground hip-hop community as someone with an unusual combination of technical ability, lyrical intelligence, and the kind of authentic storytelling that the most demanding audiences in that community recognized and respected. But recognition in the underground hip-hop community of the late 1980s did not translate into a recording contract, and recording contracts were what stood between an artist and a commercial career. Jay-Z spent years trying to secure a deal with an established record label, and failing, not because the talent was absent, but because the major labels of that era were not yet fully equipped to understand or market the kind of hip-hop he was making. The industry's gatekeepers applied frameworks developed for earlier forms of popular music to a genre that operated by different rules and spoke to a different cultural reality. And the mismatch between what Jay-Z was offering and what those gatekeepers were able to recognize as commercially viable kept him outside the institutional structure of the music business for longer than his abilities deserved. The solution Jay-Z and his partners arrived at was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the music business. Rather than continue trying to persuade the existing industry to accommodate them, they decided to build their own. In 1995, Jay-Z, Damon Dash, and Kareem Burke co-founded Rocawear Records, an independent label that would sign, record, show, and distribute Jay-Z's music on their own terms rather than on the terms of a major label that would have extracted the majority of the commercial value while providing the distribution infrastructure. The founding of Rocawear was a declaration of independence rooted in the same logic that had driven Norma Kamali to open OMO a decade and a half earlier, the understanding that creative and commercial control were inseparable and that surrendering one meant compromising the other in ways that could not be recovered. Damon Dash was Jay-Z's Harlem-born partner and the operational engine of everything they built together. Dash brought an aggressive, unapologetic entrepreneurial energy that complemented Jay-Z's more measured strategic intelligence, when the partnership between them was productive, precisely because their temperaments and their skill sets were different enough to cover the full range of what a music and fashion business required. Dash was the hustler, the promoter, the person who pushed the business forward through the force of his personality and his willingness to operate in the uncomfortable spaces between what existed and what they were trying to create. Jay-Z was the talent, the brand, and increasingly the strategic mind who understood where the business needed to go and what it needed to become. In June of 1996, Rocawear Records released Jay-Z's debut album, Reasonable Doubt, through a distribution deal with Priority Records that gave the independent label access to the commercial infrastructure it needed without surrendering the creative and financial control that the label's founders had built it to protect. Reasonable Doubt was not an immediate commercial blockbuster by the standards of the mid-1990s rap market, but it was a critical revelation, an album that the most serious observers of hip-hop culture recognized immediately as the work of an artist operating at the highest level of the form, with a command of language, a sophistication of perspective, and an authenticity of experience that distinguished it clearly from most of what the mainstream rap industry was producing at that moment. The commercial success that followed over the next several years, driven by a series of albums that combined critical respect with genuine mass market appeal, transformed Rocawear from a scrappy independent operation into one of the most commercially powerful entities in the music industry, and transformed Jay-Z from a critically respected underground figure into one of the most recognizable names in American popular culture. That transformation happened quickly, driven by the quality of the work and by Damon Dash's relentless promotional energy, and it created a platform and a brand identity that extended well beyond the music itself into the broader cultural landscape that Jay-Z's work was helping to shape. The clothing that Jay-Z and his associates wore on stage in music videos, in the magazines that covered the hip-hop world, and in the everyday settings where their public presence was documented and distributed, was an inseparable part of the cultural statement their work was making. Hip-hop had always understood clothing as a language, as a system of signals about identity, status, affiliation, and aspiration that communicated things to specific audiences with a precision that conventional fashion marketing could not replicate. Jay-Z and Dash understood that language with the fluency of people who had grown up speaking it, and they understood that the commercial potential of that language had not yet been fully exploited by any fashion brand that operated at the level of quality and design intelligence they believed their audience deserved. As the founding of Rocawear in 1999 was the direct expression of a business insight that Jay-Z and Damon Dash had been developing for years through their observation of the relationship between hip-hop culture and the fashion brands that had been selling to their audience without genuinely understanding or respecting it. The major sportswear and streetwear brands of the 1990s had recognized the commercial power of hip-hop culture and had benefited enormously from the endorsement, explicit and implicit, of the artists and the community that drove that culture forward. But the benefits had flowed in one direction, from the community to the brands, without the corresponding flow of equity, creative control, or genuine cultural ownership back to the people whose cultural production had made those brands commercially valuable. And Jay-Z and Dash decided to change that dynamic by building a brand that was genuinely owned by and genuinely representative of the culture it served, rather than a brand that consumed that culture as a marketing asset while keeping its ownership and its profits entirely outside the community. Rocawear was capitalized with $6 million of Rockefeller's music industry earnings, a commitment of resources that reflected the seriousness of the founders' intentions and their confidence in the commercial opportunity they had identified. They hired a small team, established production relationships, and launched the brand with an initial collection that reflected the aesthetic sensibility Jay-Z and Dash had developed through years of operating at the center of hip-hop culture. And the brand's identity was rooted in the visual vocabulary of that culture, in the oversized silhouettes, the premium materials applied to casual forms, the bold branding, and the specific combination of urban energy and aspirational quality that communicated membership in a cultural world rather than simply a purchasing preference. But Rocawear was not simply replicating what already existed in the streetwear market. It was making a quality and a design argument, a claim that clothing rooted in hip-hop culture deserved to be executed with the same level of material quality and production integrity as any other premium fashion brand, and that the audience for that clothing deserved to be served by a brand that understood their culture from the inside rather than from the perspective of a corporate marketing department trying to appropriate what it did not fully comprehend. The launch was supported by the most powerful promotional platform available to any fashion brand in the world at that moment, which was Jay-Z himself, one of the most visible and most culturally influential figures in American popular culture. Every appearance Jay-Z made wearing Rocawear was a brand communication of a kind that could not be purchased through conventional advertising, because it carried the authenticity of genuine personal association rather than the paid endorsement that most brands relied on for their celebrity marketing. The brand and the artist were the same thing, expressing the same cultural identity through different media, and that unity of brand and person was the most powerful commercial asset Rocawear had from the day it launched. The commercial growth of Rocawear in the years immediately following its launch was among the fastest in the history of the American fashion industry. Within 2 years of the brand's founding, it was generating revenues that most fashion labels took a decade to reach. By 2002, 3 years after launch, Rocawear was generating approximately $250 million in annual revenue, a figure that placed it among the most commercially successful fashion brands in the country, regardless of category or demographic. The speed of that growth reflected both the size and the spending power of the audience the brand was serving, and the effectiveness with which Jay-Z and Dash had built a brand that audience genuinely claimed as its own, rather than simply purchasing as an external option. The distribution strategy that Rocawear employed contributed significantly to the speed and the scale of its commercial growth. Rather than limiting the brand to the boutique and specialty retail channels that most fashion brands at that quality level use to maintain their premium positioning, Rocawear pursued broad distribution through the major department stores and the national retail chains that reached the full demographic breadth of the hip-hop audience across the country. That decision brought the brand into contact with millions of consumers who would never have found it through specialty retail channels alone, and it drove the revenue figures that made Rocawear's growth story one of the most dramatic in American fashion history. The brand also extended aggressively into new product categories, moving from its initial apparel offering into accessories, footwear, fragrances, and the full range of lifestyle products that the most commercially ambitious fashion brands used to deepen their relationship with their customers and multiply their revenue streams. Each extension was evaluated against the same brand identity and the same cultural authenticity that had made the original apparel line work, so that maintaining the coherence of the Rocawear world across a growing range of products without diluting the core identity that gave every product its commercial and cultural meaning. The brand management discipline required to execute that kind of extension without losing the specificity that made the brand valuable was a genuine operational achievement, and it reflected both the business sophistication that Jay-Z and Dash had developed through their years at Roc-A-Fella and the seriousness with which they treated the commercial as well as the creative dimensions of what they were building. By the mid-2000s, Rocawear had established itself as one of the most valuable independent fashion brands in America. It was a business that had grown from a $6 million startup to an enterprise worth several $100 million in less than a decade. The question of what to do with that value, whether to continue operating independently, to seek a strategic partner, or to sell the brand outright to a larger company with the resources to scale it further, was one that Jay-Z and Damon Dash approached from increasingly different perspectives as the years passed and as the dynamics of their partnership evolved in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated at the outset. The relationship between Jay-Z and Damon Dash had always been productive, precisely because of the tension between their different temperaments and their different visions for what they were building. Dash was the maximalist, always pushing for bigger bets, more aggressive expansion, and the kind of bold moves that had driven the early growth of Roc-A-Fella and Rocawear with extraordinary effectiveness. Jay-Z was increasingly the strategic realist, someone whose perspective on the business had matured through years of operating at the highest levels of both the music and fashion industries into a more measured and more long-term oriented approach. That tension, which had been productive in the building phase of the business, became increasingly difficult to manage as the decisions facing the company became larger and more consequential. In 2007, Jay-Z sold his stake in the Rocawear brand to Iconic's brand group for $204 million. The sale gave Jay-Z a financial return on his original investment that validated everything he and Dash had built over the preceding 8 years, and it gave Iconic's ownership of one of the most recognized names in American streetwear fashion. Damon Dash was not part of the sale in the same way, having already departed from the day-to-day operations of Rocawear in the years preceding the transaction as his relationship with Jay-Z had become increasingly strained, and as the two men's visions for the future of the business had diverged beyond the point where a shared structure could accommodate them. The end of the Roc-A-Fella and Rocawear partnership between Jay-Z and Dash was not a single dramatic rupture, but a gradual separation driven by the same forces that end most business partnerships of long duration, different risk tolerances, different time horizons, and ultimately different ideas about what the business was for. As Damon Dash's subsequent years were significantly more difficult than Jay-Z's, the financial resources that the Rocawear and Roc-A-Fella years had produced did not sustain him through the period that followed, and the public dimension of his financial struggles became part of the narrative that the business press and the entertainment media attached to the story of what had happened to the partnership. The contrast between Jay-Z's continued ascent and Dash's subsequent difficulties was a story that attracted significant attention and generated significant commentary, much of it focused on the question of what had made the difference between two men who had started from the same position and had built something extraordinary together before ending up in such different circumstances. The Jay-Z and Rocawear story is, at its foundation, a story about the transformation of cultural knowledge into commercial power, and about the specific kind of vision required to see that transformation as possible before the evidence existed to support the belief. Jay-Z grew up in the Marcy houses, understanding hip-hop culture with the depth and the specificity that only comes from being genuinely inside it, from having grown up within the community that created it, and having spent a decade developing his own contribution to it at the highest level. That understanding was not simply biographical background. It was a form of market intelligence more valuable than anything a conventional business education or a professional consulting engagement could have produced, because it was real rather than observed, felt rather than analyzed, and specific rather than general. Indeed, what he did with that intelligence was to build, alongside Damon Dash, a business infrastructure capable of converting cultural knowledge into commercial scale without losing the authenticity that gave the cultural knowledge its value in the first place. That is the hardest problem in any business built on cultural credibility, and it is a problem that most such businesses fail to solve, because the compromises required to achieve commercial scale routinely destroy the authenticity that made the brand worth scaling. Rocawear solved that problem, at least through the years of its most significant growth, by maintaining a genuine connection to the culture it represented, rather than treating that culture as a marketing asset to be exploited from a safe commercial distance. He earned the $204 million sale to Iconics was the financial culmination of what Jay-Z and Dash had built, but the financial figure is the least interesting part of the story. The more important number is $6 million, which is what they invested at the beginning, and the more important question is not how a $6 million investment became a $204 million exit, but how a boy from the Marcy houses in Brooklyn, who had no fashion training and no design background and no institutional support of any kind, looked at the American fashion industry from the outside and identified an opportunity that the industry itself had failed to recognize, and then built the business that proved the opportunity was real. Yet the answer to that question is the same answer that runs through every story in the series this channel has been building, that the most valuable knowledge a person can bring to the problem of building something new is not the knowledge taught in institutions, but the knowledge accumulated through genuine and direct experience of the world the business is designed to serve. Ralph Lauren understood aspiration because he had grown up without it. Anne Klein understood practical clothing because she had spent her life watching women navigate the gap between what fashion offered and what they actually needed. And Jay-Z understood hip-hop culture's relationship to fashion because he had grown up inside that culture and had spent a decade at its center. That knowledge was the real capital. Everything else was execution. The boy from the Marcy houses built a $204 million fashion empire on the foundation of knowing his world more completely than anyone who had tried to sell to it before him. That is the story of Rocawear, and it is a story about what becomes possible when someone who has been told by every available signal that their circumstances define their ceiling decides to build something that proves those signals wrong. That is the story of Jay-Z and Rocawear. And if you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. If this story gave you something to think about or something to take with you, drop a comment below and tell us what landed. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this one.